What do you do when the world you know collapses in a single breath? I stood in the hospital corridor, the antiseptic smell burning my nose as the doctor's words echoed. We did everything we could. My husband Tom was gone. A heart attack at 42, no warning, no goodbye. The linoleum floor felt like quicksand pulling me under. I was Sarah, a high school English teacher, a planner, a dreamer, but none of that mattered now. My life, our life, was a house of cards scattered by a cruel gust. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead indifferent as I clutched Tom's jacket, still warm, still smelling of his cedar cologne. That night, I drove home to our small house in Asheville, North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Mountains looming like silent witnesses. It was spring 2024, but the blooming dogwoods mocked me with their cheer. Our house, once a haven of laughter and late-night talks, was now a tomb of memories. I sat on the couch, staring at the photo on the mantel, us at the Biltmore estate, grinning like we had forever. How do you mourn someone who was your compass? I didn't cry. Not yet. My body was a dam holding back a flood I wasn't ready to face. Teaching was my lifeline, or so I thought. Monday morning, I stood before my students, their faces a blur. I tried to lecture on The Great Gatsby, but my voice cracked when I reached Gatsby's unreachable dream. A student, Mia, raised her hand. "Ms. Carter, are you okay?" The room went quiet. I wasn't. I mumbled something about allergies and dismissed class early. The kids deserved better, but I was drowning in my own silence. Days bled into weeks. I'd wake at 3 a.m., the bed vast and cold, and wander the house. Tom's toolbox sat untouched in the garage, his half-finished birdhouse, a silent accusation. I'd pour coffee, let it go cold, and stare at the backyard where we'd planned to plant a garden. Friends called, left voicemails I didn't answer. My sister Emily drove from Charlotte, her hugs fierce but fleeting. "You need to eat, Sarah," she'd say, pushing casseroles I'd never touch. I nodded, but food tasted like ash. Grief wasn't just sadness, it was a thief stealing appetite, sleep, purpose. I started avoiding mirrors. The woman staring back wasn't me, hollow eyes, unwashed hair, a stranger wearing my skin. I'd always been the optimist, the one who saw silver linings. Tom used to tease me, saying I could find hope in a hurricane. But this storm was different. It didn't pass. It lingered, heavy, relentless. I kept his clothes in the closet, his razor by the sink, as if he'd walk through the door and laugh at the mix-up. Denial, I knew, was a stage of grief, but it felt like my only friend. One evening, I found his journal in a drawer. Tom wasn't a writer, but there it was, leather-bound pages filled with his blocky handwriting. I hesitated, my fingers trembling. Reading it felt like trespassing, but I was desperate for his voice. The first entry was dated a year ago. Sarah's smile today could light the whole damn town. Tears came then, hot and unstoppable. I read until dawn, each word a lifeline and a blade. He wrote about our dreams, a trip to Italy, a family we hadn't started. He wrote about me, his anchor, his home. I closed the journal, my chest tight. How do you live up to a love you didn't know was so vast? The community noticed my absence. Neighbors left pies on the porch, notes tucked under the door. "We're here, Sarah." I wanted to believe them, but I was a ghost in my own life. At school, my principal, Dr. Hayes, called me into her office. "Take a leave," she urged, her voice gentle but firm. "You need time." I protested. I needed the routine, the distraction. But she was right. I was failing my students, failing myself. I agreed to a month off, the decision, both a relief and a terror. Time was my enemy now, an endless stretch of silence. I started walking aimless treks through Asheville's streets. The city was alive, street musicians, tourists, the hum of spring, but I felt like an outsider. I'd passed the coffee shop where Tom and I had our first date, the bookstore where we'd hunt for old novels. Each place was a landmine, triggering memories that cut deep. Yet I kept walking as if movement could outrun pain. One afternoon, I stopped at a park bench watching kids chase a soccer ball. A woman sat beside me, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She didn't speak, just offered a kind smile. It was small, but it was enough to make me wonder if I could find my way back. Grief, I learned, isn't linear. It's a spiral looping back when you least expect it. I'd have a moment of lightness laughing at a memory of Tom's terrible dance moves, then crash into despair. I started writing to him letters I'd never send, spilling my anger, my love, my fear. Why did you leave me? How do I do this alone? The pages piled up a map of my unraveling. But in that unraveling, I began to see something else, the faintest outline of who I might become. Not whole, not yet, but not entirely broken. I was 9 when I first learned what it meant to hold on. Our family farm in rural Virginia was a patchwork of cornfields and stubborn hope, but that summer drought turned the earth to dust. My father, a man of few words, would stand at the porch staring at the cracked ground, his hands calloused from years of labor. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he knelt beside me in the dirt. "Sarah," he said, "sometimes you plant seeds even when the rain's a lie. You do it because giving up ain't who we are." I didn't understand then, but I carried his words like a talisman, a quiet strength that would anchor me decades later, when my world fell apart. Growing up, I was the kid who climbed too high, loved too fiercely, dreamed too big. Our farmhouse, with its creaking floors and chipped paint, was my universe. My mother, a seamstress, would hum gospel tunes while stitching quilts, each one a story of our family's grit. She taught me to find beauty in the small things, a wildflower pushing through gravel, a perfect skip of a stone across the creek. My older sister, Emily, was my opposite, cautious, practical, always rolling her eyes at my schemes. Yet she was my shadow, trailing me through adventures, from building forts in the barn to sneaking apples from the neighbor's orchard. The farm wasn't just land. It was a teacher. I learned to drive a tractor before I could ride a bike, my father's steady hand guiding the wheel. I learned patience, waiting for seeds to sprout, and loss when a storm took half our crop. By 12, I was helping with the books, my pencil scratching numbers, while Emily dreamed of city lights. Those years carved resilience into me, though I didn't know it then. I thought resilience was just stubbornness, a refusal to cry when the world said you should. There was a sycamore tree behind the house, its branches my refuge. I'd climb it after chores, book in hand, losing myself in stories of far-off places. One afternoon, I found my father's old pocket knife buried in the roots, its blade rusted but sharp. He caught me with it and didn't scold. Instead, he showed me how to carve my initials into the bark SC, a quiet claim to the world. That tree became my witness, holding my secrets as I grew. I told it about my first crush, my fear of failing, my dream of teaching. It stood through my teenage years when I'd argue with Emily over nothing, or when I'd sit with my mother, her hands trembling from long hours, and promise I'd make her proud. Leaving for college felt like betraying the farm. I chose UNC Asheville, close enough to visit but far enough to taste freedom. The mountains felt like home, their ridges a reminder of the sycamore's strength. I studied literature, fell in love with words, and met Tom in a poetry class. He was all sharp wit and quiet warmth, his grin disarming my defenses. We'd hike the Blue Ridge trails, talking about books and dreams. He proposed under a starlit sky, and I said yes without a second thought. The farm faded into memory, but its lessons lingered. Plant the seeds even when the rain's a lie. After Tom's death, those roots called me back. I drove to Virginia one weekend, the road blurring through tears. The farm was gone, sold years ago, when my parents retired, but the sycamore still stood, its bark scarred but proud. I traced my initials, now weathered, and felt a spark of the girl I'd been. She wasn't fearless, but she was fierce, unwilling to let the drought win. I sat beneath the tree, Tom's journal in my lap, and read his words again. "Sarah's stronger than she knows." Had he seen something I'd forgotten? I thought of my father, his hands rough but gentle, teaching me to drive through uncertainty. I thought of my mother stitching stories into quilts, showing me beauty in the broken. Even Emily, now a lawyer in Charlotte, had carried the farm's grit into her polished life. They'd all planted seeds, trusting the rain would come. I wasn't ready to plant yet, but I could feel the soil beneath me waiting. The sycamore's shadow stretched long as I drove back to Asheville, its presence a quiet promise. Back home, I started small. I pulled weeds from the backyard, the act mechanical but grounding. The garden Tom and I had planned was just dirt now, but I bought seeds. Marigold's his favorite. I didn't know if they'd grow, but I dug anyway, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The farm had taught me that resilience wasn't about winning. It was about showing up day after day, even when the ground felt barren. Grief is a house you can't escape. It's not just the big moments, the anniversaries, the empty chair at dinner, but the small ones that gut you. The way the kettle whistles, and no one's there to share the tea. The stray sock under the bed, still holding the shape of Tom's foot. I'd wake each morning in our Asheville home, the silence so thick it choked me. The clock ticked, the fridge hummed, but the absence of his laugh was deafening. I was 39, a widow, and the weight of that word pressed me into the mattress, daring me to get up. I tried to outrun it. I'd walk miles through the city, past the vibrant murals and bustling cafes, but grief followed like a shadow. One afternoon, I stopped at the French Broad River, watching the water churn over rocks. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but all I did was sit, my hands clenched as tourists snapped photos nearby. They saw beauty. I saw chaos. How could the world keep spinning when mine had stopped? I envied their ignorance, their easy smiles. Anger simmered not at them, but at the unfairness of it all. Tom was gone, and I was left to carry the pieces. Nights were worse. I'd lie awake replaying our last morning. He'd kissed my forehead, promised to fix the leaky faucet after work. "Love you, Sarah," he'd said, and I'd mumbled it back half asleep. Why hadn't I looked at him? Why hadn't I held him longer? Guilt gnawed at me, irrational but relentless. I started avoiding sleep, afraid of dreams where he was alive, only to wake to the truth. Instead, I'd read his journal, each entry a fresh wound. Sarah's laugh is my favorite song. How could I laugh now, knowing he'd never hear it? I stopped teaching altogether. The leave of absence stretched into months, and Dr. Hayes didn't push. My students sent cards, their loopy handwriting full of kindness, but I couldn't face them. I'd failed, Gatsby, failed them, failed myself. The classroom, once my sanctuary, felt like a stage I no longer belonged on. I boxed up lesson plans, my hands shaking as I sealed away that part of me. Emily called daily, her voice a lifeline I barely grasped. "You're still you," she'd say, but I didn't believe her. The Sarah she knew was buried with Tom. The house became a prison. Dishes piled in the sink, dust settled on shelves, and I didn't care. I'd wear Tom's flannel shirts, the sleeves too long, and curl up on the couch staring at the TV without seeing it. Friends stopped by their knocks, soft, their voices hesitant. I'd pretend I wasn't home, hiding behind curtains until they left. Isolation was easier than pity. Only Mia, my student, kept trying. She'd leave notes in my mailbox, quotes from books, doodles of stars. "You're not alone, Miss Carter." I wanted to thank her, but shame kept me silent. One evening, I found a photo of us hiking Mount Pisgah. Tom's arm was around me, his grin wide, the mountains, a green sea behind us. I traced his face, my throat tight. We'd planned to climb it again to celebrate our 10th anniversary. The memory stung, but beneath it was something else, love, stubborn and alive. I couldn't touch him, but I could feel him urging me to keep going. I cried then, not the quiet tears of before, but a raw, ugly sob that left me hollow, but lighter. I started writing to him again, letters that filled notebooks. "I'm so angry, Tom. I'm lost without you." But anger gave way to questions. What would you want from me? I didn't have answers, but the act of asking felt like a step. I began to notice small things, the way the morning light hit the kitchen, the chirp of sparrows outside. Grief hadn't left, but it wasn't the only thing anymore. I wasn't ready to move on, but I was starting to move, period. Hope is a fragile thing, like a candle in a storm. I didn't expect to find it in a cluttered bookstore on Haywood Street, but life has a way of surprising you. I'd wandered in, seeking refuge from a drizzly afternoon, the bell above the door jingling as I shook rain from my coat. The shop smelled of old paper and coffee shelves crammed with books that seemed to whisper stories. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a distraction from the ache that followed me everywhere. That's when I met Clara. She was behind the counter, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, glasses perched on her nose. She looked up, her smile warm, but not intrusive, and asked if I needed help. I mumbled something about browsing and drifted to the poetry section, my fingers grazing spines. Tom loved poetry, though he'd never admit it to anyone but me. I pulled out a worn copy of Mary Oliver, the pages soft from use, and sank into a chair. Clara appeared later, offering a mug of tea. "You look like you could use this," she said, her voice gentle. I took it, startled by her kindness, and managed a nod. We didn't talk much that first day, but I kept coming back. The bookstore became my sanctuary, a place where grief didn't scream so loudly. Clara never pried, but she'd share small stories about a book she loved, a customer who'd made her laugh. One afternoon, she handed me a journal, its cover embossed with leaves. "Write what you can't say out loud," she suggested. I hesitated, thinking of the letters to Tom, but took it. That night, I wrote about the bookstore, about Clara's quiet presence, about the flicker of warmth I felt sitting among those books. Clara was a retired librarian, widowed herself years ago. She didn't say it outright, but I saw it in the way her eyes softened when I mentioned Tom. She'd lost her husband to cancer, and though she didn't dwell on it, her resilience was a quiet hum. She'd rebuilt her life piece by piece, and the bookstore was her haven. I envied her calm, but I also clung to it. She started inviting me to help with small tasks, sorting books, dusting shelves. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose, a reason to get out of bed. One day, she asked me to read at a poetry night she hosted. I froze, the idea terrifying. My voice felt rusty, my heart too raw. But Clara's steady gaze made me say yes. I chose a poem Tom loved, one about love enduring beyond time. The night came, and the bookstore was packed, faces lit by candlelight. My hands shook as I read, but the words carried me. When I finished, the room was silent, then erupted in applause. Clara hugged me, whispering, "You're stronger than you think." For the first time, I believed it might be true. Hope wasn't a flood. It was a trickle. I started noticing the world again, the way the mountains glowed at dusk, the laughter of strangers in the street. I'd sit with Clara after hours sharing stories of Tom, and she'd listen, her presence a balm. She introduced me to others, a painter named Leo, a musician named Aisha, who came to the bookstore for its warmth. They didn't know my story, but they welcomed me, their chatter pulling me out of my shell. I wasn't whole, but I was less alone. I kept writing in the journal, not just to Tom now, but to myself. What do I want? The question scared me, but it also stirred something. I started dreaming again, small dreams, a garden, a return to teaching, maybe even a trip to Italy. Clara's belief in me was a mirror, reflecting a Sarah I'd forgotten. Grief still lingered, but hope was taking root, delicate but stubborn, like the marigolds I'd planted in the backyard. There's a moment when you have to face yourself, no filters, no excuses. For me, it came on a cold November night, rain hammering the roof of our Asheville home. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by Tom's things, his journal, his flannel shirts, the birdhouse he'd never finished. I'd been clinging to them as if letting go meant erasing him. But that night, something shifted. The weight of my grief, my anger, my fear, it was suffocating me. I couldn't keep running. I had to look into the abyss and decide who I was going to be. I started with the journal. I'd read it cover to cover, memorizing Tom's words, but I hadn't let myself feel the truth behind them. He'd written about our future, about the life we'd build. Sarah's my home, no matter where we go. But he was gone, and I was still here, living half a life. I was angry at him for leaving, at myself for stalling, at the world for moving on. I grabbed a pen and wrote not to him, but to the Sarah I'd lost. You're not weak. You're scared. And that's okay. The words felt like a confession, raw and terrifying. I moved to the birdhouse next. It was rough nails bent from Tom's clumsy hands. He'd laughed, saying it was rustic charm. I'd kept it on the shelf, a relic of our plans. That night, I took it to the garage, my breath clouding in the chill. I found his toolbox, the tools heavy and unfamiliar. I didn't know what I was doing, but I hammered a nail, then another. The wood splintered, but I kept going, tears mixing with sweat. It wasn't about finishing the birdhouse, it was about proving I could start. The shirts were harder. I'd worn them for comfort, their scent fading with each wash. I held one, my chest tight, and imagined Tom's voice. You don't need my shirts to carry me. I folded them, each one a small goodbye, and packed them into a box. Not to forget him, but to make space for me. The act was agonizing, but it was also a release, like loosening a knot I'd tied too tight. I looked at myself in the mirror that night, really looked. The woman staring back was tired, her eyes red, but there was a spark I hadn't seen in months. I wasn't the Sarah I'd been, but I wasn't a ghost either. I thought of Clara, her quiet strength, and the farm where my father taught me to plant through doubt. I thought of Mia's notes, Leo's paintings, Aisha's songs. They'd all seen something in me I hadn't. It was time to see it too. The next day, I called Emily. I'm struggling. I admitted, my voice steady. She didn't lecture, just listened, then said, You're finding your way. I hung up and drove to the bookstore where Clara was sorting books. I told her about the night before the birdhouse, the shirts. She hugged me, her arms strong. You're not just surviving, Sarah. You're living. Her words echoed Tom's journal, and I felt a surge of resolve. I wasn't done with grief, it would always be there, a quiet companion, but I was done letting it define me. I started planning small steps. I'd return to teaching, maybe part-time. I'd finish the garden, plant those marigolds. I'd face the world not as Tom's widow, but as Sarah, whole in my own way. The abyss was still there, but I wasn't falling. I was standing, hammer in hand, ready to build. No one walks through darkness alone, even if it feels that way. After that night in the garage, I started seeing the hands reaching out to me. Hands I'd ignored for months. They weren't just from Emily or Clara, but from strangers who became allies in ways I never expected. Asheville, with its quirky charm and tight-knit spirit, had a way of weaving people together, and I was slowly becoming part of its fabric again. There was Leo, the painter from Clara's bookstore, whose wild beard and paint-splattered jeans made him look like he'd stepped out of a folk song. He'd linger after poetry nights, sketching in a battered notebook. One evening, he slid a drawing across the table, a sketch of me reading, my face lit by candlelight. You've got a fire in you, he said, his voice gruff but kind. I laughed, embarrassed, but kept the sketch. Leo didn't know my story, but he saw my struggle, and his quiet gestures, sharing a coffee, telling stories of his own losses, became a bridge back to the world. Aisha, the musician, was another surprise. She played guitar at the bookstore's open mic, nights, her voice soulful and raw. One night, she dedicated a song to those carrying heavy hearts. I felt her eyes on me, though she never said it outright. Afterward, she sat with me, her braids swinging as she talked about her brother lost to addiction. You don't get over it, she said, but you learn to carry it lighter. We started meeting for coffee, her humor a lifeline. She'd drag me to street festivals, her laughter infectious, and for a few hours, I'd forget to be sad. Then there was Mia, my student, who refused to let me disappear. She'd bike to my house, leaving baked goods and notes. One Saturday, she showed up with a tray of brownies and a bold request. Teach me to write better, Miss Carter. I hesitated, my confidence shot, but her earnestness won me over. We sat on my porch revising her essays, and I found myself teaching again, not as a job, but as a gift. Mia's persistence reminded me of the girl I'd been climbing sycamores, unafraid of falling. The community stretched beyond them. A neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, started mowing my lawn without asking, waving off thanks with a grin. At the farmer's market, a vendor slipped extra apples into my bag, saying, "You look like you need a little sweet." These small acts, unasked for, were threads stitching me back together. I began to see Asheville not just as a place of memories, but as a living, breathing network of care. One day, Clara invited me to a community cleanup by the French Broad River. I went expecting to pick up trash and leave. Instead, I found myself laughing with strangers, our gloves muddy, our voices loud over the river's rush. A woman named Rosa, her accent thick with southern warmth, shared her own story of loss, a child years ago. "Keep moving," she told me, her eyes bright. "That's how you honor them." I nodded, my throat tight, and kept picking up bottles, feeling lighter with each one. These allies didn't erase my pain, but they shared its weight. I started giving back small ways, at first helping Clara with the bookstore baking cookies for Mia's debate team. Each act was a step out of isolation. I thought of Tom, how he'd charm anyone with his easy grin. He'd love these people, I realized, and that thought made me smile, not cry. My allies were teaching me that healing wasn't solitary. It was collective, a chorus of voices saying, "You're not alone." Memories are slippery things, both anchor and blade. After months of dodging mine, I realized I couldn't move forward without facing the past. Tom wasn't just in his journal or his shirts. He was in the places we'd loved, the dreams we'd shared. Reclaiming those pieces meant revisiting them, not to dwell, but to weave them into who I was becoming. It was spring 2025, now the Blue Ridge Mountains bursting with green, and I felt a pull to rediscover the Sarah who'd laughed with him, who'd dared to dream. I started with the Biltmore estate, where we'd spent lazy Sundays wandering the gardens. I drove there alone, the ticket booth, a small hurdle of courage. The azaleas were in bloom, their colors vivid against the stone paths. I walked where we'd walked, remembering Tom's mock-serious tour guide voice, his arm warm around me. The memories hurt, but they also grounded me. I sat by the reflecting pool, writing in Clara's journal. "You're here, Tom, but so am I." It wasn't closure, it was connection, a way to carry him without breaking. Next was the bookstore, where we'd met, not Clara's, but a dusty shop near campus. I hadn't been back since college, but I found it unchanged, creaky floors, shelves stuffed with treasures. I ran my fingers along the poetry section, picturing Tom's grin as he'd read me a terrible love poem. I bought a book of Rumi, one we'd loved, and read it on a bench outside, the words a bridge to our past. The shopkeeper, an old man with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. "Just remembering," I said, and he nodded as if he understood. I drove to Mount Pisgah, the trail we'd hiked countless times. The climb was steep, my legs burning, but I pushed on, the forest alive with birdsong. At the summit, the view stretched, endless mountains rolling like waves. I'd brought Tom's journal, reading an entry about our first hike here. "Sarah's fearless when she climbs." I wasn't fearless now, but I was trying. I scattered a pinch of soil from our backyard, a quiet offering, and felt lighter, as if I'd left some grief behind. Back home, I tackled the garden. The marigolds were sprouting, fragile but stubborn. I dug deeper, planting tomatoes and herbs, my hands caked with earth. I thought of my father, his lesson about seeds and rain. The garden wasn't just for Tom. It was for me, a reclaiming of joy. Mia helped one weekend, her chatter filling the air. "You're like a farmer now," she teased, and I laughed, the sound surprising me. I started teaching again, just a few classes. My students were new, but their curiosity was familiar, pulling me back to the Sarah who loved words. I taught the Odyssey, talking about homecoming, and saw my own journey in it. The classroom felt like mine again, a space where I could honor Tom by sharing what we'd loved. Reclaiming the past wasn't about erasing pain. It was about making room for life. I hung Leo's sketch in my living room, a reminder of the fire he saw. I played Aisha's songs while cooking their rhythm a pulse of hope. The sycamore's lessons, Tom's love, my ally's kindness. They were all part of me now, a mosaic of memory and strength. Some decisions change everything, like a river carving a new path. For me, it was the choice to return to teaching full-time, to step back into the world, not as a shadow, but as Sarah Carter whole in my own way. It was late spring 2025, and I stood in my classroom, the chalkboard, blank, my heart racing. I'd been offered my old position, and though fear whispered I wasn't ready, something louder, Tom's voice, my father's grit, Clara's faith, urged me forward. This was my turning point, the moment I chose to live again. The first day was chaos. Kids shuffled in their energy electric, and I fumbled through introductions. But when I started teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, something clicked. I saw their faces light up, hands shooting up with questions. I wasn't just teaching, I was connecting, sharing the love of stories Tom and I had cherished. Mia, now a junior, grinned from the front row, her pride a quiet anchor. After class, she hugged me. "You're back," she said, and I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. Teaching wasn't easy. Some days grief ambushed me, a student's essay about loss, a line from a book Tom loved. But I leaned into it, sharing small pieces of my story with my students. "Life hurts," I told them once, "but it also heals." They listened, their silence a gift. I started a writing club, encouraging them to tell their own stories. Their words, raw and brave, reminded me why I'd chosen this life. Outside the classroom, I kept building. The garden flourished, marigolds bright against green. I invited Clara, Leo, and Aisha for dinner, the house alive with laughter for the first time in years. We ate under string lights, their glow soft, and I felt Tom's presence not as pain, but as warmth. I was honoring him by living, by opening my home, my heart. I decided to travel too. Not Italy, not yet, but a solo trip to Charleston, a place Tom and I had planned to visit. I walked cobblestone streets, ate shrimp and grits, and wrote in my journal by the ocean. The waves carried my thoughts, and I felt free, not from grief, but with it. I bought a postcard for Emily, promising we'd go together next time. She called that night, her voice thick. "I'm proud of you," she said, and I believed her. The turning point wasn't one moment, but many, each choice a brick in a new foundation. I joined a hiking group, my legs stronger with each trail. I volunteered at the river cleanup again, Rosa's smile a constant. I even tried painting with Leo, my canvas a mess, but my heart full. Each step was a declaration I was here, I was enough. Grief hadn't vanished. It was there in quiet moments in the empty side of the bed. But it was lighter now, woven into a life I was choosing. I thought of the sycamore, its roots deep, its branches wide. I was like that tree, scarred but growing, reaching for light. Teaching, loving, living, they were my way of saying yes to the world, to Tom, to myself. Building a new life is like planting a garden. You start with dirt, hope, and a lot of patience. By summer 2025, I was learning to trust the process, to see the sprouts of joy amid the scars. My classroom was my anchor, the students' voices, a daily reminder of purpose. But beyond those walls, I was crafting something new, a life that honored Tom, but wasn't defined by his absence. It was messy, imperfect, but mine. I expanded the garden, adding lavender and sunflowers, their colors a quiet rebellion against grief. I'd work in the evenings, dirt under my nails, the air thick with honeysuckle. Clara joined me sometimes, her stories of her own rebuilding a guide. "You don't replace what's lost," she said. "Pulling weeds, you grow around it." I nodded, understanding. The garden wasn't just plants. It was a promise to keep growing too. Teaching grew richer. I designed a unit on resilience, blending literature with real stories, mine included. I told my students about Tom, about the farm, about the bookstore. They wrote essays about their own struggles, their courage humbling me. Mia's piece about her mother's illness won a state award. At the ceremony, she hugged me, whispering, "You taught me to be brave." I cried not from sadness, but from pride. I was making a difference, not just surviving. I leaned into my community. Aisha invited me to sing backup at a gig, my voice shaky but alive. Leo taught me to sketch our sessions full of laughter. Rosa and I cooked together her gumbo recipe, a new favorite. These connections weren't replacements for Tom. They were additions, proof that love could expand. I hosted a barbecue, the backyard glowing with lanterns, and felt the house breathe again, alive with voices. I started planning bigger dreams. I applied for a grant to fund a community writing program inspired by Clara's bookstore. The application was daunting, but I poured myself into it, imagining a space where stories could heal. When I got the approval letter, I ran to Clara's, waving it like a kid. She poured us tea, her grin wide. "You're building something beautiful," she said. I was, and it felt like a gift. Grief still visited. A song on the radio, a couple holding hands, small triggers that stung. But I'd learned to sit with it, to let it pass. I kept writing, not just to Tom, but about my hopes, a trip to Italy, a book of my own. The journal was thick now, a map of my journey. I'd read it sometimes, marveling at how far I'd come. I hiked Mount Pisgah again, this time with Aisha and Leo. At the summit, we shared stories, the wind carrying our laughter. I felt Tom there, not as a ghost, but as part of me woven into my strength. The scars were still there, but they were softer, part of a life I was choosing every day. I was building anew, not from scratch, but from love loss and the stubborn hope that carried me through. The sun set slowly behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, as if the world is pausing to breathe. I stand in my garden marigolds, swaying in the warm August breeze, their petals bright against the earth. It's 2025, and I'm not the Sarah I was 2 years ago, nor the girl who climbed sycamores, but someone new, stitched together from love loss and stubborn hope. I've learned that healing isn't a destination. It's a journey, each step, a quiet victory. I think of Tom every day, his laugh still echoing in my heart. His journal rests on my nightstand, its pages worn from my touch. I don't need to read it anymore. His words are part of me, urging me to live fully. The birdhouse hangs in the garden, unfinished, but whole in its own way, a symbol of what we built together. I've kept his love not as a weight, but as a light guiding me through the dark. My life is full now, not despite the pain, but because of it. The classroom hums with stories, my students teaching me as much as I teach them. The writing program at Clara's bookstore is growing, a haven for voices that need to be heard. Aisha's music, Leo's art, Rosa's warmth. They're my family, not by blood, but by choice. Emily visits, often our bond stronger for the storms we've weathered. The sycamore's lessons, my father's grit, my mother's quilts, they're all here, woven into the woman I've become. I'm planning Italy next summer, a promise to Tom and myself. I'll walk the Amalfi Coast, journal in hand, and feel him beside me, smiling. But I'm not chasing his ghost. I'm chasing life, the messy, beautiful chaos of it. Grief hasn't left, but it's quieter now, a soft hum beneath the melody of my days. To anyone listening, I say this: your pain is real, but so is your strength. Plant your seeds even when the rain feels far. Reach for the hands around you, the Claras, the Mias, the strangers who become home. Write your story, not to erase the hurt, but to make space for hope. You are enough, just as you are, scars and all. The stars are emerging now, pinpricks of light in the velvet sky. I close my eyes, the garden's scent wrapping around me, and whisper to the night. I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm not alone. The world is waiting, and I'm ready to meet it.